today I want to discuss a plausible way to look at the current plandemic that many of us are being suppressed by in our society. So that's what we're going to do today, and I welcome you to Natural Law Health. So first and foremost, I want to start by reminding everyone that I am hosting a live human anatomy and physiology course through UXL, and we are meeting on Thursday nights. We had our first meeting this past Thursday, and all of the meetings are going to be recorded, and you will have access to the replays. I will put the link if you'd like to join the live meeting with us every week, where you can interact with me directly. But after that recording is over, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be hosting, or I guess posting, all of those recordings on my own personal website, in addition to videos like the one I'm giving right now about other topics in science, the human physiology, biochemistry, all of that people might find interesting. So let's talk about the genetic expression, or what we call the scientific dogma. This is really kind of the way in which we express ourselves genetically. And so genes are, traditionally thought of that which is passed on to us from our parents. Mom and dad both give us half of our genetic information during fertilization. And then, we express those genes within our DNA molecules to become specific proteins. And proteins really are what we are. Everything from hair color to skin color to whether or not you have a specific enzyme that can, work in a specific type of metabolic activity or a specific metabolic function. Those are all genetically determined, okay? So one thing that was quite interesting when I was in graduate school many years ago, one of the big things at that time was the Human Genome Project, and everybody was kind of wanting to know, how can we figure out all of the genes in the human genome? And, prior to the completion of this project, it was estimated that there must be, over 100,000 genes in the human genome because, humans are just so complex. And there are so many proteins that these genes should code for. So if we have, over 100,000 proteins, we must have over 100,000 genes. Well, come to find out, we have fewer genes than, I think a flea. So we are not as genetically complex as a flea is. I should double check that, but I know it's some really small, kind of parasitic organism. We really aren't that genetically complex. And so everybody started kind of scratching their heads a bit, like, why is it we have so few genes? And then they also realized we have a lot of what they call junk DNA, which I really don't think it is junk DNA, as I'm about to bring forth to you. So bring us, forward in time to today. The year is 2020. And we have this virus that is, highly infectious, and the reason for so many deaths, and there's a whole theory as to what is going on with this pandemic, and many people like myself are questioning it. And what I want to bring forth to you today is kind of another alternative explanation for what is going on right now. So with that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share my whiteboard that I use in teaching. All right, so here we can see my whiteboard. Let me get this into place. And what I'm going to do is draw, a partial cell. So here's the cell membrane, and so this is my cell, okay? Phospholipid bilayer in the cell membrane. And inside of our cells, we have a big nucleus, which houses our genetic information. And I'm going to draw some DNA. So DNA, it's actually a twisted double helix. Okay, there's our DNA molecule. It's two nucleotide strands that are complementary base paired. And, the central dogma is that the DNA is transcribed into a single-stranded RNA molecule. That process is called transcription. And it's a specific type of RNA molecule. It's called messenger RNA. So to denote that, we put a little M in front of that. The messenger RNA then leaves the nucleus. It hooks up with a ribosome. And from that, we have a process called translation. And basically what the messenger RNA is made up of are sequences of codons. Each codon, which are, 3 nucleotide base pair, or 3 nucleotide chains, each codon does correlate to an amino acid, and that gives us a specific chain of amino acids. There are about 20 different amino acids from which we can produce proteins. And this would be our kind of protein. It's a little bit more complex than how I've written it, but this is kind of the very simplistic way of describing this process, okay? So when we come back to, DNA, we have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs of chromosomes. And when I say 23 pairs, so like 23 times 2 is 46, you get 23 from mom, 23 from dad. And when you look at all 23 pairs of chromosomes, and you see that in one chromosome, there are just small little segments called genes. And so this would be one gene within a much bigger chromosome. There's a lot of sequences between the genetic regions that don't code for any protein. So they would not be, ultimately through this process of protein synthesis helping us produce proteins. But what they do produce are something else. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about, okay? So anyway, these proteins, by the way, when they're produced, they can do a variety of things. Proteins are the most multifaceted types of organic molecules within our body. So like I said, we have structural proteins in our hair, keratin in our body, like in our bones and connective tissues. We have collagen fibers. Those would be considered structural proteins. We have contractile proteins in our muscles, actin and myosin. We have enzymes. Many enzymes are protein. Many hormones are proteins. The antibodies that help to work in our immune system, they too are protein in their chemical makeup. So proteins do everything in our body that is kind of functional. They make up who we are, and what we express is protein. So they're quite important, right? Okay, so that being said, let's look at another thing that can happen though with that junk DNA. So let's pretend this is not a gene, but instead it is part of that, not very nice to say, junk DNA. It's kind of like calling something useless. You're like, it's just junk. You can get rid of it. Well, now we realize that it's not really junk. Junk DNA, they have found to code for what are called microRNAs. So I'm going to switch my screen just for a second, and I want to bring in this article, okay? And you can see at the top, junk DNA codes for valuable microRNAs, miRNAs, which are non-coding DNA sequences. Now this one's focusing on one that can affect diabetes, okay? This is from, unfortunately, a pharmaceutical business. All of the major scientists are all working for the pharmaceutical companies. But anyway, here we go. And I just pulled this up because it did correlate junk DNA into what these microRNAs are. Okay, so we've got that said. Let's come back to now the my drawing that I was working on with you. So I'm going to share my screen again. And so let's pretend that instead of us having a gene coding for a protein, we have junk DNA coding for the microRNA, the miRNA, as we saw in that previous journal article. So I will color code it red. We'll call it miRNA. So these microRNAs, they do not code for proteins, and they're not going to be translated into a protein as we saw with the messenger RNA as I drew earlier. What these microRNAs do is they come into the cytoplasm of the cell. So basically in the cell you have the nucleus, everything outside of the nucleus, but inside the cell membrane is cytoplasm. And then these microRNAs exit. And they're going to be encapsulated typically in little pieces of our cell membrane. There's a process called exocytosis that can release these little microRNAs. Okay, so they're released. What do they do? Well, they're now looking into their function, but here is what I would like to propose to the alternative scientific community, and I call them alternative because they're not programmed by the pharmaceutical companies and other chemical organizations like Monsanto, which is now taken over or bought by Bayer. But all of these scientific companies which control much of academia and the scientific research that's occurring, especially in the United States. It's all for tunneling research so that people can make tons of money selling chemicals like pharmaceutical drugs and things like, weed killers like Roundup and anything else that, basically destroys nature. And, from my point of view, I think pharmaceutical drugs do destroy nature, the nature being life, right? So we're going to look at these microRNAs once again. So what I think microRNAs are, in fact, because most of our genome, most of our DNA is made up of this not so nicely called junk DNA, right? So maybe instead of calling it junk DNA, we should call it conscious DNA. So I'm going to now change the name from junk DNA, boom, 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 to conscious. Or maybe we'll call it woke DNA. How about that? Let's call it woke DNA. Doesn't that sound a little bit more cool? My black marker doesn't work too well. Woke DNA. Woke DNA does not code for protein, but it does code for microRNA, which then can be released from the cell through a process called exocytosis, where part of the cell membrane is released, holding that microRNA. Now, these microRNAs, in my opinion, they're functioning in communication. All right? And what we would call something like this would be an exosome. So the product of exocytosis is an exosome. And here's another interesting little tidbit of information. Exosomes look a hell of a lot like viruses. So exosome and virus, right? Exosome and virus morphologically, meaning that shape-wise, what they're made up of, genetic information inside of a phospholipid bilayer that is, encapsulating it. These two things look exactly the same. And this one, we are demonizing. We're saying, oh, this is a bad thing. We need to get rid of it. We need to inject ourselves with lots of, toxic vaccines so that our body can build antibodies against this. Well, there are other scientists, medical doctors, that have proposed that the virus is nothing but an exosome. So let me kind of give you a plausible reason why these viruses might exist. Now, I am a naturopath, and I'm a traditional naturopath. I have an allopathic background, actually. I went to a regular allopathic medical school. I actually, even after that, went into a PhD program where I was killing lots of poor little mice. And both of those programs, the medical school and the PhD program, I walked away from because my soul could not align with the work I was doing. I'm not going to kill animals in the name of finding some pharmaceutical drug because it was an immunology program, and a lot of it was, again, being funneled into pharmacological agents. So what did I do instead? I ended up teaching because, what else can you do if you have accumulated a lot of education and you don't know what to do with it? So I went into teaching, and that gave me time also to kind of be a musician, which I was for about 15 years. With that said, the exosome and the virus, same thing practically. It's morphologically, shape-wise, made up of the same things. And I believe that these viruses are actually exosomes from any organism in the body, or any organism, not in the body, but any organism on our planet. Now, I heard, I think it was a interview with Dr. Zach Bush. Love this man. He is such an awakened soul, a medical doctor looking at the microbiome and comparing that to the soil microbiome and how we're just completely devastating our ecosystems on our planet. But I heard him describe, during the very beginning stages of this plandemic, that, when this all occurred in Wuhan, China, what was going on in Wuhan, China, in that whole area of China? Well, first and foremost, there was a lot of pollution. China is notoriously spewing out lots of pollution into their environment. Also, there's a lot of animal torture going on in the name of creating food. So they have a lot of swine all tied up, and they're in horrific conditions, as they are in America as well. I mean, it's not just a problem in China. In America we have cattle and pigs and chickens, and they're living in just unnatural and also torturous living conditions. It's very, very sad. These animals are stressed, they're angry, and it's just no way to treat a miracle that we call a living entity. They have feelings, they have emotions, they feel pain. And when they're in these types of environments, totally unnatural, the sun does not hit their skin, they can't smell fresh air. All they can smell is like the other animal that's, put into a very close containment with them in a cage or something like that. These animals are stressed. And what I feel that happens in stress is that our bodies and animal bodies, they try to communicate that stress to those around them. It's a natural thing, and even in our own body, we do these kind of things. Like any virally infected cell, and I say virally infected cell, does release things that can tell other nearby cells that, hey, I've been virally infected. We have communication taking place. And that communication does put other cells in an awareness so that they can be prepared for something abnormal going on. Well, I think that, all life does this. And I think that this is the pathway to express a stressful event that is going on in a living being. So their woke DNA will transcribe a microRNA, which will then be released as an exosome, and that's meant to communicate to other beings that something abnormal is going on. Now, what does that communication do? Well, it's preparing maybe their immune systems to upgrade, or perhaps to prepare for that equally devastating condition. Maybe perhaps the pigs and the chickens and the cattle are letting us humans know that this is not right. This is dangerous. Please do something about this. Please help us. And this is where the virus comes from. And and every virus, whatever it's kind of infecting, is going to kind of cause that cell to become much like it, and the fact that this is genetic information that can somehow affect the cell that this enters into. So, if we talk about the virus, it can go into the cell, just like the exosome exits the cell. It's the same thing. All right. So anyway, I wanted to kind of put forth out that kind of explanation, because in my A&P course, we do talk about, in fact, what we're going to be talking about this Thursday is the cell, and we will be talking about genetics, and I'll probably mention this little tidbit of information, but I like to add these to my course because you don't get this kind of information in a traditional, brick and mortar college that is funded by the government, and government is slavery, and it's mind control. Government, gubernare, that means to control, and ment means mind, right? So everything is controlled in our society, and everything is occulted. That is important for us to know. So I want to share this, that perhaps what this virus is it's a communication that we are living in an unnatural state. We are destroying our environment. We are torturing animals throughout this planet. And this is what the result of all of that unnatural, torturous living is doing. We have to get back to nature. We truly have to get to a point where we are no longer destroying our environment with pollution. We have to stop all of it. Another thing, Dr. Zach Bush, that I learned from listening to his interviews is that he is describing the symptomology associated with this viral infection. And again, infection I put in quotes. That, the virus, it accumulates and kind of brings in with it certain chemicals in the environment, including the polluted environment, because a lot of these outbreaks were concentrated in cities where there was a lot of pollution, as well as a greater number of elderly in the population. So, look at Italy, look at China with all of the pollution. New York has a lot of pollution. And some of the pollutants that were being brought into the humans that were showing symptoms were pollutants like cyanide. And the symptomology does kind of correlate to that, cyanide poisoning. They were noticing hypoxic individuals. So they weren't really expressing a high white blood cell count, but they were showing tissue hypoxia. And, not that I don't like drugs at all, but this could be why hydroxychloroquine works so well, because it's an anti-malarial drug. And malaria, that parasite, affects the red blood cells. And so cyanide poisoning does as well. And so that drug can kind of change the shape of the red blood cell to kind of help with oxygenation of the red blood cells, so you're not, killing the patient. Putting the patient on a ventilator was killing them. You have to address what, is really causing this issue, and it looked like cyanide poisoning. And many physicians that were working in the front lines saw this, and they said, this does not look like a normal respiratory viral infection. It looks like, a hypoxic disorder like, cyanide poisoning. So anyway, that's, another thing that, the pollution, the abnormal environments we're creating, and the destruction of our ecosystem and our biosphere. This virus is simply, communication. And everything is communication. We communicate all of the time. You can't stop the communication. All living beings are sharing what is going on within them. And we're connected to everything. We're connected to all life on this planet. We do not, exist alone. We are connected. And this microRNA, releasing the exosome, communicating what is going on cellularly within that organism, and then sharing it with other organisms, perhaps creating symptoms in them, but yet waking them up. And what has happened to us during this time, during this lockdown, many people are becoming more awoken, much like our woke DNA, right? So we are becoming more aware. That's all, raising our consciousness is realizing that we are awakened souls. We are not, meant to be working in cubicles 40 hours a week, some people 80 hours a week. We are not meant to be living in unnatural environments. We really are meant to create beauty on this planet, because beauty is the fabric of life. Beauty is what connects us all. And we're destroying that beauty. There's beauty in life. All life is beautiful and miraculous and so amazing. And yet we're treating it like junk. Again, we don't have junk DNA. We have woke DNA. And that woke DNA is meant to communicate with us through exosomal excretions to be shared with the world around us. So let's kind of try to rise in consciousness as we move forward, instead of destroying everything around us. My next video that I'll probably talk about is going to probably focus on the microbiome, which has a lot to do with this as well. So there's going to be a lot of videos that I'm going to be putting forth, and many of this will be included in my course. So if you do want to sign up for my Human Anatomy and Physiology course, I am a Human Anatomy and Physiology professor, but I'm teaching it in a way that hopefully can help you understand what is really going on in this planet. This information no longer should be occulted, and these theories should be shared. And please share this video. Thank you for taking the time to watch this, and I will see you all later.